Hey everybody, this is Russ Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the latest budget handheld from MagicX. This one is called the 135. And at first glance it reminds me a lot of the old school retro handhelds that we used to see a few years back from companies like Anbernic. It's got a blocky overall design to it, D-pad centric, but it's got one little twist to it. You've probably already guessed it, but yes, this thing has dual D-pads, which means that you can flip it over on its side and then use it like this to play vertical games, arcade games, Nintendo DS, and so on. Admittedly, it's not the most comfortable setup. You can see the D-pad and face buttons are all the way at the bottom of the device like this, so it definitely feels lopsided. But I found over the past week and a half that I've really come to appreciate what this can do from a retro gaming standpoint. It's got a wonderful screen and a lot more power than you would think for under $100. And when all is said and done, I found this to be one of the better retro handhelds that I've seen over the past few years. It's got a good price for the performance, an excellent screen, and the controls are surprisingly good too. I honestly think that we have another sub $100 hit on our hands, so grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, let's talk about the specs first. Number one, this is using the Helio G85 8-core CPU. We got enough power here to play the vast majority of retro games and quite a few PS2 and GameCube games if you don't mind tweaking the settings a little bit. For anybody who's been into these handhelds for a while, I found the performance to be about on par with the Unisoc T618 processor that we found in quite a few devices a few years back. We got a decent 4GB of RAM in this, and then also 64GB of internal storage for the operating system, and you can also use a microSD card to expand it further. The display definitely punches above its weight class. It's 3.5 inches, but with a high resolution of 960 by 640, making it a perfect 4x integer scale of Game Boy Advance. This 3:2 aspect ratio LCD is the same specs that we saw with the iNeo Pocket Micro that came out a couple years ago. We've got a decent battery too, 4,300 mAh. I've found on average a mix between 4 and 8 hours of gameplay depending on how heavy of a system that I'm actually playing. Of note, you can charge it with just about anything. USB-C, fast charging, all of that works, and I've got an average of 8.5 to 9 watts of charging speed. In terms of weight, it's fairly lightweight. It's 6.6 ounces or 189 grams. As far as connectivity, it's pretty decent. 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0. Of note, this device does not support video out, at least according to my testing. It's running Android 12 as its operating system, and it does have Google Play Store installed if you want to install additional content. But as I'll show later, they've done an excellent job pre-configuring the software, so you really just have to drop in your games and then you can start playing. Beyond that, we've got some other basics like a Hall sensor analog stick, a rumble motor, as well as a 3.5mm headphone jack. And for all these specs, I think the price is decent. It's currently $85 before shipping, but it will go up to $95 retail at some point, and they are charging somewhere between $10 and $15 depending on where you live for shipping. They're offering 3 different colors. I've got the black one here for testing, but they have one that they call blue, which looks very purple, and then also a gray model as well. I think the gray one would have been my choice if I had to pick between the 3. It's also worth noting that if you pay an additional $20, they will send out a 128GB card, which is the one that they sent over to me. It is going to be loaded up with a bunch of ROMs, but of note, it's not going to have some Nintendo IP on it like Mario games. But it is worth noting that you can just load it up with your own games as well. It's a very easy process. I'll talk you through it here in this video. Let's take a look inside of the box, and of note, MagicX did send this over to review, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. The box itself is relatively small and thin, and it doesn't have a lot going for it other than the specs here on the bottom, and then it also shows the different color options and different storage options as well. Inside the box, it's very simple. We've got the device, a screen protector, an instruction manual, and then a USB-C to USB-A charging cable. And first impression, this thing reminds me a lot of the old school retro handhelds that I reviewed on this channel when I first got started back in 2020. If you look at something like the Anbernic RG351P or even the more recent Anbernic RG35XXH, you can see that yes, all 3 of these share very similar DNA. The RG351P also does have a 3:2 aspect ratio display, but it's half the resolution of the MagicX. The 35XXH is 3.5 inches, but 4:3, so a little more squarish, and it has a 480p resolution, which again is going to be less than the MagicX, and this one is much more powerful as well. Back in 2022 and 23, when companies were making handhelds with the Unisox T618 processor, like this one here, the Anbernic RG405M, I always wanted one that was smaller and plastic and a little bit more portable. And we never really saw one. They were always bigger devices, and it almost feels like the MagicX 130 is filling that gap, but just 3 years later. So right off the bat, yes, I'm excited about the 135 just because it is that small, little powerful handheld that I always wanted back then, but now we finally got it. The second thing I noticed when I took it out of the box was this right D-pad, and at first I definitely thought this was a gimmick. After all, it's got like these little buttons on the side that allow you to hold it and click on the shoulder buttons while using it like this. It's just kind of an awkward setup in general, but the thing I didn't think about with this D-pad is that it's an excellent placement in general for just standard retro gaming, and that's because without an analog stick on this side, it's a very comfortable experience. I'm not hitting anything as I'm holding it, and so even though yes, this D-pad may not actually fit your unique playstyle with this particular handheld, I love that it's there because it's just out of the way for when I'm really just playing retro games. And then finally, my third impression when I first picked up the handheld was that it does feel relatively cheap. It is lightweight, like I mentioned before, about 6.5 ounces. And then also the plastic material in general just feels a little bit cheaply made. Now, I don't think it's a bad thing in general. It just feels like a cheap retro handheld, but it is also a little bit more on the expensive side compared to some of the cheaper options. Now, this one has a lot of power compared to those other ones, which we'll talk about later. But in general, yes, this feels like a cheap retro handheld. So let's talk about the controls. We'll start with the D-pad. So this is a rubber membrane D-pad. It's going to have that kind of bouncy and classic feel like a Super Nintendo controller. And yeah, it's got a good amount of pivot to it and just overall bounce. They did a good job fine-tuning the accuracy on this one as well for a variety of different use cases. With the contra test, where I press down on the D-pad and rock it left and right, lightly, it doesn't make the character move at all. If I push it hard enough, I can definitely make the character move. This is kind of an ideal setup for me where I'm not going to get false diagonals. I'm not going to accidentally press on the diagonal, but I can definitely go in that direction if I push it hard enough. And so this is exactly what I want to see when it comes to precision platformers. I think they did a good job. It also does a decent job with Street Fighter style games. My Hadoukens and Shoryukens can be pulled off pretty easily. I think that it's a little bit mushier than I would like. I think that I would like the post to be just a little bit taller so that we had a bit more pivot to it. But in general, I think it's something that I could acclimate to very easily. So I think as far as retro handheld D-pads go, this is probably one of the better rubber membrane ones that I have tested. It's accurate in all the best ways. We've got a single analog stick, and this is a Hall sensor. And my only complaint about this one is similar to my complaints with their other handhelds in that it's a very good stick, but I think it's inset just a little bit too much. I understand they're probably trying to make it pocketable and flush with the D-pad itself, but in general, it does make it a little hard to control just because the stick itself kind of goes underneath the overall shell as you push it to one side or the other. And so as you move your thumb around, it just doesn't feel as good as I would like. Here's one of their first handhelds, the 028. I think this is the version 2 one. And you can see that, yes, same kind of setup here. Excellent sticks, but they are quite flush with the rest of the case. And so I do feel like this is a bit of a compromised experience. I wish it was just maybe a millimeter taller. Now, thankfully, these sticks can actually come right out, so you can kind of pull them off. And it's the exact same post that we've seen with a bunch of other handhelds. So if you've got anything else laying around from like Retroid or AYN or even some of the more recent Anbernics, this is going to work on it. We've also got third-party options like this one called Hype Sticks, which you can find on Etsy, and these are a little bit taller, which means that you can use them with the 135, and yeah, they're going to fit on just nicely, and it does stick out a little bit more. Obviously, it's going to make it a little bit less pocketable because it might catch on your pocket liner, but in general, this feels like a much better experience when using the analog stick. So in the end, I would probably prefer this to be a little bit taller, but I don't think it's the end of the world because it is an easy fix, and I think the overall input is excellent. It's a full Hall sensor, and it doesn't have any cardinal snapping or anything like that. So an excellent stick all around other than the height. Also on the left side, we've got this G button. If you tap on it, it's a back button. In Android, you press and hold, it'll be a home button. We've also got a small LED right here, which will turn red when you're charging it and then green when it's done charging. On the right side, we've got the face buttons. These are glossy and then also a rubber membrane, so they've got a nice classic retro feel to them, and no complaints here. They feel excellent and they are basically silent. Below that, we have our start and select buttons, which are strangely labeled sideways, but that's because you can hold this device like this and then they make sense. And then we have our D-pad on the right. The look and feel of this is exactly the same as the other one, so no complaints there either. On the top, we've got a USB port for charging, and then one of our two shoulder buttons. We've got one on each side. This is for when you're holding the device vertically. I don't find this to be the most comfortable setup in the world. There's not a lot of space here, like you can't comfortably rest your finger inside of it or anything. Instead, it's just kind of there to be able to press down if you want to, but it really is going to depend on the game. I think maybe some DS games where you could use these shoulder buttons, that might be a good fit. But in general, if I am going to be playing a vertical game, I just don't use these buttons at all. Also unique are these shoulder and trigger buttons because they do not stick out from the shell at all. It makes it a very pocketable and nice experience, but it is a little bit weird to get used to the placement of them. We've got these little indents, as you can see here, with the trigger and then the shoulder button, so you can kind of feel your way around, but it's not the same as a raised one where you can kind of feel exactly where they are at any time. And so there are some moments when I'm not really sure which button I'm pushing down on. I think for the vast majority of retro games, you'll probably be using these for hotkeys more than anything, but if you can think of a retro game that relies on shoulders and triggers, this is probably not going to be an ideal experience, especially compared to something that has like stacked shoulders and triggers as well. So in general, I don't really like the positioning and placement of these, but they get the job done for most of the games that I've been playing on it. On the left side, we've got our volume up and down buttons, and then on the right, we've got our micro SD card slot, and then finally on the bottom, we've got our two stereo speakers, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and then our power and sleep button. Now the audio quality of these speakers is not half bad for a small retro handheld. Let me give you a couple examples really quickly. So nothing to write home about, but I think the audio here is acceptable. You can hear a difference between the stereo on the left and right, and I think the separation between the mids, highs, and lows isn't half bad either. Now the unique thing about this setup is that even though these bottom firing speakers sound just fine when you're holding it horizontally, it's a little bit awkward to have your sound coming out of only the left side when you're holding it vertically. So that is one thing I've noticed as well, is that the overall sound experience when playing it vertically is not ideal. Not a lot going on the back other than you can see that there is grippy texture on all four of the corners. And honestly, I really like it. I like the feel of it. It gives it just a little bit extra texture. And as I'm holding onto it, I can feel that. And so overall, I think it's a good move. Of note, there is no active cooling fan on this, so we just have a little ventilation, and that's about it. I have felt the device getting a little bit warm when playing high-end stuff, GameCube, PS2. So in general, if you're going to be trying to push performance, it might get a little bit warm in your hands, but nothing I felt was really noteworthy. As far as ergonomics and comfort, I'm not really sure what to say here. I think it's very comfortable to hold and play retro games with. It's just your candy bar slab style setup, and it's D-pad centric, and the buttons feel great. So in general, in playing retro games, I've had no complaints with it altogether. The only complaints I would really have are the shoulders and triggers, which feel a little bit unintuitive. You kind of have to feel around to know exactly where you are. And then finally, the idea of using this vertically. There's just not a lot of space for your hands in general. Now, many of these handhelds can be played vertically like this as well, so this is no surprise to me either, but because it is so thin, it's probably not something that I will play a lot of vertical games on in the first place, because this is a novelty. It's fun for a couple minutes, but after that, I don't think I could play a long session with this. Now, MagicX did release a vertical handheld last year. It's this one. It's called the 040, and this one's kind of fun. I made a video about it, and it's mostly made for DS games and vertical arcade games. This one, to me, is a lot more comfortable to hold just because it's wider, and so I would rather play vertical games on this than the 135. Now, this one is quite wide, and so I wouldn't really consider it to be pocketable compared to the 135, which I think fits really nicely in pockets overall. And that's because, again, this thing has a very retro and slab handheld vibe to it, and I'm here for it. I think it looks really neat. It's very easy to pocket because it is relatively thin and nothing really sticks out too much from it either. And so because of its lightweight and its overall size, I would say this is definitely a pocketable handheld. Let's talk a little bit about the screen. It's 3.5 inches, 960 by 640 resolution, making it a perfect 4x integer scale of Game Boy Advance, which was also a 3:2 aspect ratio. It goes up to 500 nits at peak brightness, and I think it looks pretty good. It's visible in direct sunlight, as you can see right here. This is about 1 p.m. in Hawaii, so the sun is beating down on it pretty hard, and I can still see Sonic in the background. Now, there are several different reasons why this is an excellent screen for retro gaming. Number one is going to be Game Boy Advance. This obviously can play at a 4x integer scale, and it looks amazing. You can throw on an LCD grid shader on top, and you can just go to town like this. I think it's an awesome experience overall if you are a fan of Game Boy Advance games. 3:2 is an awesome aspect ratio for a lot of different retro games, including some wider stuff like Wonder Swan Color. That's going to look pretty good here. And I think it's pretty decent when it comes to playing PSP as well, or other 16:9 content. You're only going to get about 3.4 inches of usable screen space when playing PSP, so it is a little bit small, but I think it's definitely doable. Another big draw for me that I remember from the iNeo Pocket Micro is this exact resolution does an excellent job with certain 4:3 systems like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. And that's because it is very close to an integer scale, but it's actually a little bit over. What this means is that we can use overscale to cut off just a few pixels on the top and bottom. I think it's something like 6 or 8 pixels on each side, and it's going to allow you to play this at integer scale with a 4:3 aspect ratio. And because you're cutting off the top and bottom, that's actually going to blow it up a little bit, which means that the 4:3 bars on the left and right are going to get even smaller. So if we go into RetroArch and then go into scaling, if you turn this on to overscale right here, and then we can turn on integer scale, what you'll see is the image will get a little bit bigger. And so it's going to cut off a little bit at the bottom and the top, but it's not going to cut off that much. So if you press it like that, you can see that yes, it gets very close to cutting off something, but it doesn't. And that's because a lot of these retro systems accounted for the fact that we would have overscan at the top and the bottom with CRT televisions. And so a lot of time they didn't put game information at the very top and the very bottom. So even if you're going to be cutting off pixels, it's not something the developers intended for you to see in the first place. So for Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis, this is what I would recommend doing. Turning on integer scale, but having the overscale turned on. So it is going to cut off a little bit at the top and the bottom, but you're going to have integer scaling that's going to make it a little bit wider, which is going to fill out the screen nicely. And then of course, it's just going to look super sharp and clear. And so if you're the kind of person that wants really balanced pixels, I would definitely recommend going this route. Let me give you an example of a retro gaming experience you could have on this handheld. So here I am playing Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo with that overscale turned on, so it is integer scaled. And then I added a CRT shader. This one is CRT Consumer. It's not the most heavyweight in the world, but it is what I would consider to be kind of a medium class CRT shader. It looks great. You're not going to be able to play the super high-end CRT shaders on this particular chip, but several will play fine. On top of that, I can also turn on 1 frame of run ahead, which is also a bit CPU intensive, but works fine on this chip. And so this is going to give us improved input latency. So it's going to feel a little bit snappier too. So for me, this is a pretty ideal retro gaming solution. We've got that integer scale plus a CRT shader as well as run ahead, and it feels excellent. Okay, let's briefly talk about the software. It's a pretty easy setup. So it's going to come preloaded with this front end. It's called the Dawn Launcher. It looks very much like Daijisho, but it's actually self-contained and very easy to set up with some nice customization inside. I mentioned before, but this review unit came with a 128GB card, so it was already preloaded with a bunch of ROMs, but I personally prefer to add my own. Initially, what I did is I went into the Google Files app, and then I went through and deleted a bunch of games and then added my own via a USB drive like this. This took a little bit of time, but because it's a touchscreen, it's not that hard to actually set up. But then I realized it's probably even easier to use your own card. And so let me show you how that setup is going to work. And that's what I would actually recommend. So plug in your own card here, and then go over to the settings here. You can tap over with the trigger button, then find this one right here, select Game Library Directory. From there, it's going to ask you to choose a folder, and it's going to install all of the folders that you're going to need to add your own games, like a PSP folder for PSP, NES, and so on. Once you've done that, you can eject the SD card, put it into your computer, add all of your games, and then you can go to this part in the settings. This is Update Games List and Configuration. So run that. It's going to rescan your folder, and from there, it's going to pick up on all your games, and then you can scrape them as well. From there, you should be able to just navigate through the front page here by tapping on the shoulder button and find all your different systems. And once you find a system that you want to test, you can just click on it, and then you'll find your games listed. You can again scrape these if you would like, then press the A button. It'll launch the game right then and there. And the device will already come pre-configured with RetroArch and all the other emulators, so you don't have to do any sort of configuration, which is kind of rare for an Android-based handheld. To exit out of a game, you can just tap on the G button. It's going to go back, but I found that that doesn't sometimes close RetroArch. So I actually went in and created my own hotkeys. Because select and start are right next to each other, I didn't want to use that. So instead I did select and L3. So I press those two, it's going to actually exit out of the game and do a clean exit. And then I've got it set up to auto save and auto load. And so the next time I load up the game, it'll also save it too. If you ever need to get into the apps that they already have pre-installed, you can just go into the app section like this and then choose them all from here for your configurations. For example, with RetroArch here on the bottom right. So all the testing that you'll see here in a minute, I did just with the standard apps that came pre-installed with the device. And I was very impressed with the overall setup that they had. The only thing I really wanted to change, like I mentioned, were the hotkeys in RetroArch, but otherwise it was pretty impressive. One other thing worth noting is that they actually have OTA updates on this. So you can go into online updates and then select that. And then it'll say whether or not you have the latest version and you can install a new one. I actually already did install one myself here on this device a few minutes ago. In addition, they have their own GitHub page that they've been pushing all their releases to as well. So you could just navigate to this on your device, tap on this to download the APK, and then install it this way as well. These are all in a beta release, and after a couple weeks, they actually pushed them over to the OTA updates. So you don't actually have to do this. You can just wait for them to arrive on your device as well. So in general, I don't really have a lot of complaints about this OS setup. For being an Android device, it doesn't really feel very Android. Yes, I can go into apps and I can hit on the all, and then I can see things like the Google Play Store, or I can go to a web browser. I can do all that stuff on this device, but I like the fact that it kind of just feels like a retro gaming console at the same time as well. One other thing worth noting is that when you find a game that's vertically oriented, like this arcade game, All Points Bulletin here, so there is a little bit of setup to actually get this to work vertically. What you want to do is press the Y button to bring up the per game settings. And here you can make a bunch of adjustments based on the game. You can change the performance mode here. You can change out which emulator to run on it. But the most important thing is the screen rotation. So I can go in here and then I can choose whether or not I want it to be just the default, which will be based on the platform, or I can make it horizontal and vertical. If I make it vertical, that means every time I launch this game, it's going to be in the vertical orientation. And in addition to making the screen rotate, it's going to rotate the controls as well. So up and down, left and right will work properly. Same thing with the buttons. So they've got it all figured out, but you will have to do that one time only for your vertical arcade games. For something like Nintendo DS, they're all just going to play vertically in the first place. My only complaint is that we don't have a lot of theme options for this. Essentially, we've got this really dark theme like this. It's got a bunch of text on it. I think it's a little bit busy. And then if we go into settings, there is one other option, but I don't think it's the best either. So here under platform wallpaper selection, we've got two options. We've got the Dark Knight and then Dark Knight 2. So not a lot going on here. And if we restart it, you can see that there's not a lot of big changes here. It just changes the overall theme and look, but it's not that big of a difference. And unfortunately, some of these games will not actually work properly. So if we go over to, say, for example, PS2, it's not going to show anything with this particular theme. So not perfect, and I wish that there were more options here, preferably something that we could download on the fly like you can with Daigisho or other front ends like ESDE. So at the end of the day, I've just been sticking with the regular default theme that came with it. It's not the best in the world, but at least it shows something for every system. And yeah, I wish that we had more colorful and vibrant options, maybe some that are a little bit cleaner and not so text heavy, just to make this feel like a more retro console. Okay, now let's talk about performance. We'll start with the easy systems and work our way up. We'll start with Game Boy. Now, all these are going to have the default settings other than a couple tweaks here and there. For example, here with Game Boy, I've added some green colorization to the overall settings, and then I also added an LCD grid shader. But otherwise, yes, this is just running stock as it was already pre-configured. The overall screen real estate for Game Boy and Game Boy Color is going to be 2.9 inches. So not super huge with a smaller device like this, but I still think it's very playable. As we were already talking about, Game Boy Advance is going to absolutely shine on this device. It's going to take up the entire screen. It's going to have that integer scale, throw on an LCD grid shader, and that's basically all you have to do. So if you are looking for a very small, lightweight GBA machine, this is going to be excellent. You can even put the overall performance mode in power saving mode. And so you're going to get up to about 8 hours of gameplay on a single charge like this. So overall, an excellent Game Boy Advance experience. One of the best systems that you can play on this handheld. Like I already mentioned, WonderSwan Color is a similar aspect ratio. So these games are going to play great. And the cool thing is that there are many games in this catalog that will play vertically oriented as well. So if you wanted to play like this, you can totally do it. Now, bear in mind, the vast majority of this catalog is going to be be in Japanese, and so you either got to learn that language really quickly or find some sort of fan translations. Either way, we don't see a lot of WonderSwan color representation in these handhelds, and it's pretty cool that this one just fits so nicely. I already talked a lot about our home console systems, Nintendo and Super Nintendo and Genesis, and all these are going to play great. And like I mentioned, if you use that overscale, you're going to be able to play these at an integer scale with a little bit of the screen cut off at the top and bottom, but I think it's well worth it for the vast majority of the games because you're not going to lose a lot of information by cutting off those pixels at the top and bottom. Once you turn on that overscale, it is going to make the image a little bit larger, and so it's going to be somewhere between 3.3 and 3.4 inches of overall screen real estate. Not the largest in the world, but it is exceptionally sharp. In fact, it looks so nice that I rarely will use CRT shaders, but you can definitely do that as well. In general, I think we've got a lot of options here with this chipset and the screen and the overall resolution. Let's talk a bit about Nintendo DS. So by default, it's going to run the Drastic emulator at a 2x resolution upscale. All the games are going to play just fine from a performance standpoint, and the screens will be stacked one on top of each other. Because there isn't a gap between the two, it will make some of the overall screens look a little bit off-center because in general, the original DS had that little gap at the hinge, and so some of the orientation just may not line up perfectly, but in general, if you want to play with both screens at once, this works out pretty well. I personally don't see myself playing a lot of DS on this device, even though it does have a touchscreen, just because it's a little bit awkward to hold and it's uncomfortable, and even though you do have the access to those shoulder buttons, it's also a little bit weird to play as well. So I think this is really going to be a personal thing, but for me, I think I would rather use one of the many clamshells that we have right now that can play DS games a little bit more properly. Moving over to arcade games, this is another way that we can use that vertical orientation. Obviously, if it's a horizontal game, you can just play it as is, and that's going to be an excellent experience, and even some of the more heavyweight games will play just fine on this. But at the same time, playing vertical arcade games is pretty sweet on this. I just wish that the controls weren't so far down below on the device. It feels a lot like just flipping over a standard horizontal handheld and then playing it in vertical mode. It's never been my ideal way to play these types of games, but I like that they went so far as to add that additional D-pad. So again, I respect that they did this, but I just personally don't see myself playing it this way when I have so many other options to enjoy this handheld. Speaking of which, let's talk about the 3D era games. This is where things get very interesting. So you can play PS1 games. I usually will upscale it to a 2x or sometimes a 3x resolution upscale. Really going to depend on the game and how I feel, but we've got enough power for it. For Nintendo 64, you could upscale this, but I found that a 480p resolution is about as crisp as I'm going to get on this handheld, and you can play every single game at full speed like that, and so that's just what I did. I set it to a 480p resolution and just enjoyed these games as is. By default, it's going to use the standalone Mupen emulator and it works out just fine. You might get a couple accuracy issues with this particular emulator, but the performance is going to be just great. The only game that I really saw some heavy glitches in was Mario Tennis, which is notoriously hard to emulate just because of the accuracy issue, but in general, yeah, the performance was just fine. One thing to consider is that that bottom D-pad kind of works like C buttons, and depending on the game, that might be great, but I found that in practice, it's a little bit weird. So for example, with Killer Instinct Gold, this is one that uses the C buttons to actually do the kicks and punches and whatnot, and it's super awkward when trying to use it with a second joystick, but with this D-pad, it's a little bit better, but not as good as actually using buttons. It's an insanely strange thing to press two D-pads at the same time when playing a game like this, but you can definitely pull it off. It really, again, will depend on the type of game that you're playing. I also found that the lower stick placement was kind of hard when it came to games that relied on accuracy with the left analog stick, like GoldenEye. This game plays at full speed, but I was not able to really control it very well. Like, it just felt a little bit awkward with that small stick that's pushed so far into the shell. Moving on to Dreamcast, I did a very similar thing here where I played everything at a 480p resolution, and by default it's going to run the Flycast emulator core within RetroArch, and all these games played at full speed as well. Even heavy hitting stuff like Dead or Alive 2, no problem whatsoever, and so I think there will probably be a couple Dreamcast games that will struggle on this, but the vast majority of the catalog is going to be very playable at a 480p resolution. So I think that, yeah, if you want to play Dreamcast games on this device, it's going to be a pretty nice fit. Now, the first system I encountered that was definitely hit or miss was Sega Saturn, which makes sense. This is a hard system to emulate properly. By default, it's going to use the Yabasan Shiro 2 standalone emulator, and there are plenty of games that look just fine. It's not the most accurate emulator in the world, but if you don't really mind just a little bit of glitching here and there, many games are going to be playable, even Sega Rally Championship. There was a little bit of slowdown in this game, but not enough to make a lot of complaints about. Again, if you don't mind compromising with Sega Saturn, many games are going to play fine. Sometimes the accuracy is not to the point where I would find it acceptable. For example, with Virtua Fighter 2, the floor and the ground in general just did not seem correct when playing this, and so this is not a game that I would really enjoy playing. Other games like Panzer Dragoon are totally glitched out, and so I would not consider this to be playable at all. And unfortunately, by using the Yabasanshiro core within RetroArch, the performance dips quite a bit, and so this game does not play at full speed within RetroArch. And so between the combination of glitches in the standalone emulator and then the performance drops in RetroArch, I don't think that this game in particular is going to be playable. So it is definitely a hit or miss experience. It will really depend on which games you're going to be trying. In general, I would not consider this to be a Sega Saturn compatible handheld. Now on the bright side, one other system that runs great is Sony PSP. I just set this to a 2x resolution upscale, turned off all the auto frame skip and everything else, and everything played great. I got a couple glitches here and there with God of War Chains of Olympus, which is a very hard game to play, but the vast majority of all the other games played just fine. Now, the overall size is not going to be huge. It's about 3.3, 3.4 inches altogether. So it is going to be quite small and smaller than the original PSP was, but it does look very nice and crisp. So depending on how good your eyes are, I would say that, yeah, you could definitely play PSP on this system if you're looking for something very compact and portable. One more system that surprised me in performance was Nintendo 3DS using the Azahar emulator. Now, I don't think this is the most recent build, but they've got it tweaked really well. They've got a two-screen setup where you can see the top screen up above, which is relatively wide, and then a smaller screen down below in case you need to consult a map. And so by default, this is what it's going to look like, but I found that it works the best when playing single-screen style games, like New Super Mario Bros. 2, where you don't really need to see that bottom screen. And so this looks actually pretty nice. It turns it into a nice, wide platformer. I'm playing all these games at the native resolution. You might be able to play some at a 2x upscale, but in general, I found this to be perfectly fine. I don't think every 3DS game is going to play well, but there might be quite a few that will surprise you. Moving up to GameCube, this is going to be a supremely compromised experience, but depending on what you can tolerate, it might be a little bit fun. To start, the version of Dolphin that they have installed is called Dolphin for Handheld, which is a hackier fork, which allows you to basically play a lot of these games, but at a lower scaled resolution. So this is by default going to be set to a 90% resolution scale, so not quite at the native resolution, a little bit under it, but that will help with overall performance. On top of that, if you use PAL versions of ROMs, which are going to run at 50 frames per second natively, that often will mean that you will have better performance that way too. So you've got a couple tricks up your sleeve if you do want to play GameCube and PS2, and the number one thing is to use PAL ROMs, and then also use that 90% resolution scale, and yes, there are some games that are going to play pretty well. Just bear in mind that it's mostly going to be lightweight games, and even then some of these are going to have issues. With Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, this is at the very first island, which is generally very easy to run, and it's still not running at full speed, even at a 90% scale. So yes, I would say definitely don't buy this device to play GameCube, but if you're desperate enough and want to try a couple games here or there, you might be pleasantly surprised with a few lightweight games. It'll be very similar with PlayStation 2. They've also got this loaded up with Nether SX2, but I don't think it's the most recent version. It still played pretty well. They did some per game configurations already, and some of these very lightweight games like 2D side-scrolling shooters or maybe some lightweight platformers, these are going to work okay. Again, I would not expect much with this. You're not going to be able to play something like God of War on here, and you may have to go in and use underclocking or overclocking to get the game to run at a faster speed. But in general, yes, you should be able to try a few PS2 games. The same things are going to factor in here, so if you can find the PAL version of a ROM instead of the US version, it's only going to run at 50 frames per second for the most part, and that will give you a performance advantage as well. To give you an idea of the baseline, here is Jak and Daxter running on a PAL version of the ROM, so 50 frames per second, and then I'm also using a mild underclock on it, and it's still not running at full speed. So yes, only very lightweight titles are going to be playable here, but you never know, it might be worth experimenting with if you're up for it. Okay, I think that's enough testing. Let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MagicX One35. And there is a lot to like about it. And number one is the fact that it has a very classic retro feel. It feels like a handheld that was designed in 2022, but finally released in 2026 with a more powerful chipset. So it's kind of retro in its own way in the retro handheld world, but it also has the performance of what we would expect in this year. It's got excellent controls, the D-pad, the face buttons, everything feels very good. It also has that very unique double D-pad setup, which initially I thought was going to be a bit of a gimmick, but it actually works out really well when playing classic retro games because that right analog stick doesn't get in the way. It's just another D-pad. Yes, that also means that you can flip the device over and play vertically oriented games, but I found that in my week and a half of testing, I seldom played these types of games. Instead, I just took advantage of the fact that the right analog stick wasn't there. I also think it's a very good screen for this price. It's a little bit on the small side, but it's got a high resolution and it gives you a lot of scaling options. Obviously, it looks awesome for Game Boy Advance, but it does a really good job in scaling for Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Genesis as well. I also really appreciate the simple user experience that we get with their simple Android launcher. Now, this is a full-on Android device. You can have Google Play Store, you can install your games, you can do all that stuff here, but I love the fact that it's relatively plug and play. In fact, this is easier to get set up than most other Android handhelds out there. And I also think that for this $100-ish price point, we are getting a lot of performance. You can play all the classic systems. You're really only going to run into problems once you get up to Sega Saturn and GameCube and PS2. Everything else is going to run great. Last year, two of my favorite handhelds in the budget space were the Magni Air X and the iNeo Pocket Air Mini. They are of similar performance and similar price to the MagicX 130, but I think they fill different niches. This one's a wider and larger handheld, so it's kind of like a cheaper Retroid Pocket, and really excellent for PSP. This one is a 4:3 aspect ratio, so really good for classic systems as well. But I also like the pocketability and smallness of the MagicX 130. And so I feel like these three right now at around the $100 price point are the ones to get. Now, that being said, the device is not perfect, so there are a few things that I wish were better. Number one is that we have some limited theme options. We basically have two different themes to choose from, and one of them does not have box art for every single system. I'm hoping that the team, or at least the community, will come together and provide additional options. They've done that with other MagicX devices, and so I'd love to see additional theme and wallpaper options for this particular handheld. And as much as I think it is kind of cool that we can flip the device over and play games vertically, it does feel a bit like a niche control scheme. I'm not sure how many people are going to buy this device specifically for vertically oriented games, especially because it's not all that comfortable. Now, all the same, on the left side, I do put that I love the double D-pad, but that's mostly because I love using it for retro gaming because the right analog stick does not get in my way with this particular setup. So I think it does make a really big difference when it comes to playing retro games, but not in the way that they probably intended. And then finally, many people who watch this channel and buy these handhelds are a little bit older. Like me, I'm in my mid-40s, and this screen can feel a little bit small. There are so many other options out there that have much larger screens. So if you have poor eyesight, then this may not be a very good handheld in general. It's still a great screen, but it really depends on your own individual eyesight and what you find the most comfortable. Okay, so putting it all together, what do I think about the 135 from MagicX? And in general, I think it's an excellent handheld. Like I was already saying, if you're looking at spending around $100 between this and the couple other options that we have out there, it's definitely a contender. I feel like if you're looking for something that's smaller and classic, something to play your old school systems on, especially Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, Nintendo, and Genesis, this is an excellent device just because of this really high resolution screen, and it's quite comfortable as well. I've mentioned it before, but I like when these little handhelds are a little bit cheap and plasticky. It just makes it feel a bit like a toy, and that's very fitting for playing classic retro systems. And so in general, I feel like MagicX has probably made their best handheld yet with this 135. In the end, whether or not I recommend this handheld is largely going to depend on you and what you already own. If you've got something similar that can play these retro systems, then you probably don't need to pick this one up unless you really want that high pixel density of this display, particularly when it comes to Game Boy Advance and the other retro systems. On the other hand, if you're looking to get your first retro handheld, you want something small and pocketable, and maybe you want an Android OS, but something that will also hold your hand through the process, then I think the 135 is an excellent handheld overall. In this day and age, we've got so many different retro handheld options that this one doesn't feel absolutely necessary. I don't think that any handheld really does at this point, but I love the fact that this checks so many boxes along the way, and it comes at an excellent price point as well. So overall, kudos to MagicX for making a great handheld, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick one up? Do you have something similar already? Let me know what you're playing right now. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.